Well, it's been a source of massive controversy all over the world. How exactly did COVID-19 begin? The theory remains out there that it began at a wet market or it was somehow obtained from just an animal in the wild. But the going theory these days, it started off as a quote unquote fringe theory, and now it's basically well accepted as the mainstream theory is that this actually began at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Joining us on the line to discuss is Matt Ridley. He's a best-selling author. His books include Genome, The Rational Optimist, and How Innovation Works. His latest book is Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. Matt, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Great to be on it. And I've co-authored this book with Alina Chan, who's a brilliant young scientist.
So let's talk about the timeline here when it comes to the development of COVID-19. Your timeline goes all the way back to 2012. And so I think a lot of people obviously only became aware of the virus at the beginning of 2020. It was circulating in China slightly before that. But why does your timeline start in 2012?
Well, because when the virus was discovered in early 2020, it was immediately noticed by the Wuhan Institute of Virology that there was a very similar virus out there, 96.2%. That was found in the freezer of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It was collected in 2013 following an incident in 2012 in a copper mine about 1,800 kilometers away from Wuhan. That's the distance from Orlando to New York. So the question is, how would a bat virus from way down in the southwest of China have got to Wuhan? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. We now know that virus is not found in bats around Wuhan. So something brought it a long way from a long way away. And we know that the closest virus came because scientists went there and collected it. And the reason they did so was because 6 people got sick in 2012. 3 of them died. This might have been the first case of a SARS-like virus directly infecting people from a bat. And so it's an incident of considerable interest.
So in 2014, the United States announced a moratorium on gain-of-function research. What is gain-of-function research? Why do people even perform gain-of-function research? I think a lot of people look at the sort of notion that scientists make diseases more deadly or they change the function of the disease, and they freak out because that sounds something like The Stand. So what is it and why is it useful? Why do scientists do it in the first place?
Right. There's a big controversy within science between some people who think this is a very important, useful tool for understanding the enemy, for getting to know viruses and what threat they might pose. And there's other people who say, this is dangerous. This is like looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. And there was a big controversy about this, as you say, in 2014, and there was a moratorium for a few years on some of these experiments. And why did they do it? Well, the ostensible reason is that we need to understand the threats that are out there, the millions of viruses that might cause pandemics. And in order to do that, we've got to grow them in laboratories and study them. And it's not easy to grow them in laboratories. So we need to juice them up a bit so that they can infect human cells in laboratories so that we can study them better, so that we've got more samples to work on. That's the kind of rationale for this. And then we've got to work out how many genetic steps away from causing a pandemic are they? How many mutations would it require? That was the most controversial gain-of-function experiments in 2014 were about exactly that with influenza viruses. How close were they? How easily could they turn into something that would threaten mammals as opposed to birds? So they did it. They made it infect mammals instead of birds. And you can see the problem here is that, these techniques are getting pretty close to doing dangerous things with viruses. And given the fact that we do get lab leaks all the time, they're fairly frequent all around the world. Most of them are not serious, but some of them are very serious. You cannot constrain these viruses very easily, and it's very easy for people to get infected in labs, particularly if you're working at lower biosecurity levels. Then it is important, I think, to have a long, hard look at ourselves in science. And I'm a fan of biotechnology. I'm not a critic of it. And see whether these experiments are justified.
What counts as sort of gain-of-function research? This has become a topic of massive controversy in the United States, given the questions over NIH funding of research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Some people maintain that gain-of-function research is apparently just about making viruses more infectious within a species, and somehow this would exempt cross-species jumping from gain-of-function research. That seems like almost a counterintuitive notion of what gain of research function is that would be controversial. Like it would seem less controversial to increase the transmissibility of a virus within a species than to make it more transmissible across species.
Right. And this is the kind of slightly theoretical arguments that we get into. And I'm not here to take sides in a US political debate. I'm not an American. But you're right that one of the exemptions from the moratorium on gain of function research was to say, if this is an animal virus that cannot infect humans, then go ahead, do the experiments, even if you're making it more infectious within those species. And yes, fine. But then what do you mean about how does that apply to taking a virus and infecting human cells with it? Is that training it on the human species, making it easier to infect the human species? Does that count? Well, it probably does. Those experiments were done, but not necessarily in the US during the exemption. And then there was another exemption for experiments that were already underway, and so on. So there were plenty of loopholes in the moratorium that enable the NIH to say, well, yes, some of these experiments did continue, but they weren't necessarily out with the legislation. And the moratorium ended in 2017. And from then on, they said, we'll allow gain of function experiments if a committee decides they're okay. So it's very much a sort of judgmental thing.
We'll get to more with Matt Ridley in just 1 second. First, this holiday season, deck the halls, walls, windows, and doors with the best deals of the year on the award-winning Ring alarm. I'm sure you all know about the Ring video doorbell by now, but did you know that Ring makes an award-winning alarm as well? Ring Alarm is a powerful, affordable, whole home security system you can easily install yourself. So whether you're busy running across town or across the country this season, you and your loved ones can rest easy knowing your home is protected. It's more than just security. Ring Alarm protects your home from flood, freeze, and fire as well. Plus, it's a lot cheaper than the other companies. For what they charge for a month, you get an entire year of Ring Alarm with professional monitoring. Right now, for the best deals of the year on Ring Alarm, go to ring.com/Ben. I use Ring to keep track of my kids. And frankly, I have 3 kids. They're running all over the place. And sometimes you look around and you're like, uh-oh, where'd the kid go? Well, that's when it's a great time to pull up that Ring app and see where, for example, your 5-year-old son went. And is he setting something on fire? So this holiday season, deck the halls, walls, doors, and windows with the best deals of the year on the award-winning Ring Alarm. Head on over to ring.com/Ben. Get a great deal on a Ring Alarm security kit today. That's ring.com/Ben. You'll be keeping your family safe. It is a great device. It's easy to install, and it's not going to cost you a fortune. Ring.com/Ben. So we fast forward now to 2018, and it's pretty clear at this point, according to your timeline, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is doing tremendous numbers of experiments on bats and bat viruses. They even filed for patents on bat breeding cages. So there's a lot of smoke here as far as if you're looking for sort of smoke as to where this virus was developed. This seems like the timeline. So what sort of smoke are we seeing at this point?
Right. Well, by 2018, we now know, and largely thanks to leaks and freedom of information requests, we now know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is the leading institute for studying bat-borne SARS-like coronaviruses in the world by a mile, it's got more samples of these, it's doing more experiments than these, it's publishing more results on these viruses. We now know that they had done experiments that increased the infectivity of these viruses by swapping parts of the spike gene with other parts. We know that in 2018, they were collecting viruses not just from southern China, but also from Laos, Cambodia, and other neighboring countries, bringing them back to Wuhan. We know they were sequencing these viruses, and they had hundreds of different versions of SARS-like viruses in the lab. What we don't know is what they'd collected after 2016. The hundreds we know about were all collected before 2016. And that's what we'd really like to know. And then we found out only just a couple of months ago that there was a plan to put a thing called a furin cleavage site into the genome of one of these viruses with a view to making it slightly more infectious, or very much more infectious, as part of a way of making it easier to study it. Now, that plan wasn't funded by the US government, by the Pentagon, to which the application was made, but it may have been funded by the Chinese government. Now, that's very interesting because this virus has a furin cleavage site in it. None of its relatives do. No other SARS-like coronavirus does. And it's an increasingly large mystery as to how it got its furin cleavage site. We don't think in our book that we know the answer. We don't think we can rule out that it came through a market route, through the food chain. But we do think that there is a huge amount of smoke, as you say, that suggests that finding a SARS-like coronavirus outbreak in humans in the only city with a huge SARS-like coronavirus research program deserves a certain amount of scrutiny.
We're speaking with Matt Ridley. The book is Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. So again, we only become familiar in the West, at least in the United States, with COVID-19 in January. In late January, the WHO is still maintaining that there is no human-to-human transmission of COVID-19, which of course ends up not only being untrue, but pretty obviously a lie by the Chinese government promulgated via the WHO. As it turns out, the first diagnosis of COVID-19 is happening, it now appears, back in November of 2019, so months before the rest of the world was even notified about all of this. And as you note in the book, there's a lot of alarm bells going off in China about COVID-19, especially among people who are associated with the Wuhan Institute of Virology by early and mid-December.
That's right. It's the middle of December when the hospitals start picking up cases and saying, hang on, there's something happening here. And it's pretty obvious from some of these early cases that they're not all catching it from animals. Some of them are clearly catching it from each other. You know, there's families coming in who've infected each other and things like that. Retrospectively, we can be pretty sure that there were cases in November. That there was a leaked document which the South China Morning Post had, which showed a 17th November case. But that was retrospectively diagnosed. It wasn't till mid-December that they start picking it up. And once they start picking it up, some of the hospital doctors raise the alarm and say, we've got something that looks awfully like SARS. This could be very dangerous. And they get punished for spreading the word. I mean, they get reprimanded and shut down and told to shut up. Now, that is not the way to stop a pandemic early in its tracks, to tell doctors off for talking about it. So, you know, the real worry is the possibility that we could have stopped this pandemic if there had been a more sensible approach from the Chinese authorities in December. Whereas, in fact, as you say, right up until the middle of January, the Chinese authorities and the World Health Organization are saying, despite Taiwanese insistent to the country, but Taiwan is ignored by the World Health Organization because at China's behest. Despite that, they're saying that there's no human-to-human transmission.
I mean, it really is amazing. I mean, you talk about in the book the fact that the Chinese vaccine developer Sinopharm is already manufacturing a vax by the beginning of January. Meanwhile, they're simultaneously telling the rest of the world that all is well. There's nothing to really worry about here. And it's only at the very end of January we start hearing human-to-human transmission. And it is because of that timeline delay that we don't shut down travel. It is because of that timeline delay that a lot of countries in the West aren't taking this seriously. I remember being on the air when all this was happening, and I was citing the WHO. I was saying, well, you know, the WHO is saying there's no human-to-human transmission. We still have only individual cases cropping up. And so I think this sort of 2020 hindsight where it's like all the politicians knew in late January how bad this was going to be. It just seems like that is 2020 hindsight. The only people who absolutely knew how bad it was were the people inside the Chinese government.
That's correct. I'm the same. I was taking World Health Organization reassurance at first sight. You know, I mean, I believed it. And, you know, it was a while before it became clear that this had escaped and become global. Once it was out in February, and people all over Europe and North America were picking it up, there was no way we were going to stop it with travel bans, probably not with lockdowns either. Vaccines were probably going to be the only way we were really going to get on top of it. We might slow the spread with lockdowns, but whereas if we had been completely apprised of the situation in late December and had taken the precautionary approach that this may well be spreading human-to-human transmission, then I think it could have been nipped in the bud, and 5 to 15 million people who are now dead would not be dead.
So one of the things that you talk about in the book is also the amazing official move in so many of our scientific journals to shut down any talk about the possibility of a lab leak theory. At the very beginning of the pandemic, you had people like Peter Daszak who were working very hard to suppress any possibility that people would be discussing the lab leak origin story. There were social media companies that were suppressing any stories that were being written about this sort of stuff. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why that narrative was shut down so early and why it was seen as such a fringe theory from the very beginning.
It is an extraordinary aspect of the story. neither Alina Chan nor I began by thinking that the lab leak was likely. We were seeing papers from virologists saying it's not possible, it's a conspiracy theory, it's a crackpot idea. And they were confusing two things. One was the idea that it was a deliberate release of a bioweapon, and the other was that it was an accidental release of a virus that was being studied in a laboratory. And that helped to shut it down. But there was clearly a confluence of interest here between the Chinese authorities, which didn't want the finger pointed at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and Western scientists who didn't want the finger pointed at science in general. And a lot of Western politicians who were somehow, took the view that it was highly unlikely it would have come out of a lab. We haven't had pandemics out of labs before. Well, we haven't been studying viruses in this depth before, is the answer to that. And somehow all this came together, and a really weird piece of censorship happened for best part of a year, whereby you weren't allowed to discuss the possibility of a laboratory leak on various parts of social media. Scientific journals and mainstream media were very hostile to this. It changed in May 2021 when, after a farcical World Health Organization investigation, it became clear that you couldn't rule out this possibility. And by then, the trail had gone cold on the wet market. They'd tested 80,000 animals in China, and none of them had the virus. So in the case of SARS and MERS, we knew within 2 months how people were getting infected in the early days. And China had not shared any details of the early cases, still haven't. So it's very surprising to me as somebody who believes in science and open inquiry that so much establishment science was so resistant to being open-minded about this possibility. And actually that left a vacuum for people who hate science to come in and make these points, which is one of the things I regret about this.
And the book, again, is viral. The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. The co-author is Matt Ridley. So, Matt, this is one of those areas where I know you're not political, but you do have to wonder about the leverage that China was able to exert throughout this entire process in preventing, number one, information from getting out, and number two, manipulating the WHO, and then number three, in suppressing the narrative afterward, because obviously, as you say, there was a confluence of interest to prevent any dissemination of information on this. People on various sides of the aisle who were sort of seen as kooks for a year were reporting on this as early, I remember, as like April, May of 2020. And this was seen as completely insane. And then by January, you had the U.S. State Department that was issuing a fact sheet, possibly questioning whether it was a lab origin issue. And then by August, the Biden administration is like, well, maybe we'll investigate. They do their little investigation. They come up with nothing because, as it turns out, the Chinese are just not transparent. It should be, I think, frightening to the future of both scientific inquiry and disease suppression that the Chinese government was able to wield this much power throughout the process.
I agree with you. And I think, going back 10 or 20 years, China was a relatively reasonable player in the world, and you could have a conversation with it about various things. In the last few years, it has become extraordinarily propagandistic. The sort of wolf warrior diplomacy thing has led to really very naked pushing of one line. And, they put out a thing just yesterday saying that I was a liar for writing this book. I don't know which, they won't, of course, say which lies, I've told. There's a strong tendency in the Chinese government to try and propagandize this story. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a laboratory leak. They also don't particularly like the idea of it coming from a wildlife market, because that threatens the traditional Chinese medicine which Xi Jinping champions, which is why they tried to accuse other countries of sending it to China on frozen food, which was a sort of bonkers theory if you thought about it for literally 5 minutes. So yes, there is a problem here, and there's a problem in the West too, because we're desperate to get the Chinese to sign up to climate treaties. We're desperate to get them to collaborate on trade and lots of other issues. So we do sometimes soft pedal issues. And you remember Australia put its neck out the Australian government in the spring of 2020 said, let's have an independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19. They didn't say it had come out of a lab. They didn't even use that word. And yet for saying that, they were hit with very severe trade sanctions by the Chinese government. That is not the way to conduct this kind of thing. What we need is a pandemic treaty where all countries agree to share any information that's relevant when a pandemic begins. And if China won't sign that, well, then we'll know their true colors.
I mean, this, I think, really is the question: is what do we do for the future here? So you mentioned the possibility of a pandemic treaty here. It seems like this sort of thing could easily repeat itself. I mean, we've had several viral outbreaks over the course of the last 20 years. This one, obviously, by far the most deadly. But there's talk about the possibility that a far more deadly virus, the IFR on this thing turned out to be a lot lower than originally thought. Originally, we thought the infection fatality rate was going to be 3 to 5%, which would have meant not 5 to 15 million people dead. It would have meant maybe 10 times that amount. It turns out that it's much lower than that, but there's no reason to think that this couldn't happen again. So what sort of steps should we be taking as the West to protect ourselves, given the fact that there's so much dishonesty floating in the ether here?
Yeah, well, it's not an easy question at all, and I think one of the things we have to find out how it started, because that's the best way of preventing it, is to know what we're dealing with. If it started through the food chain, then we need to regulate the food chain better. If it started through research, then we need to regulate research better. We need to take a leaf out of the airline industry's book. They brought down fatalities by an enormous percentage, almost got rid of them, through a technique of basically sharing information. Basically saying whenever a plane crashes, the lessons that will be learned for that will be shared across the industry and across the world. Everybody will be able to learn from what happens. And that was a crucial part of increasing safety in the air. I think we ought to do the same here. We ought to get people sharing information so that we can understand what risks we're running, either in the laboratory or in the food trade or in some other way. And that feels to me like an urgent piece of diplomacy. I don't see it on the agenda of the G7 or the G20 or any of these organizations. I think it should be.
This is Matt Ridley. His book is Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. It is a must-read, certainly a scary reminder of exactly where we are at this point in time with regard to world mobilization against viruses like COVID-19. Matt, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.